It's funny, isn't it? How the most life-altering conversations can happen in the most ordinary, or sometimes, the most deceptively elegant of places. The clink of silverware against fine china, the murmur of hushed conversations at nearby tables, the almost theatrical presentation of a perfectly cooked steak. These can form the backdrop to moments that shift the very ground beneath your feet. Sometimes, the writing isn't just on the wall, it's been etched into the server logs for months. If only someone was looking closely enough. Or perhaps, if the right person already was, and Henry Bishop, or Hank, as those who knew him well enough might call him, was indeed the right person. At 42, Hank had a way of seeing patterns, of understanding the intricate dance of data and human intention. He'd spent 11 years as the quiet, unassuming backbone of Heartland Components Incorporated, or HCI, a manufacturing firm in the heart of Crestwood City. Not that you'd know it from their glossy annual reports or the carefully curated company website. No, Hank's contributions were written in lines of code, in the seamless hum of machinery across 3 production facilities, in the calm that prevailed when chaos should have reigned. The lunch was at the chairman's grill, the kind of establishment where executives sealed deals and impressed clients. Not the kind of place you typically dismantled someone's career over dessert. But Walter Sterling, HCI's CEO, always had a flair for appearances, a certain polish that often masked a more pragmatic core. "Hank," Walter began, his voice smooth as the aged whiskey he often favored, "you've been invaluable, truly." He paused, cutting precisely into his filet mignon. "But we're looking to go in a different direction with our tech division. Fresh perspectives, you understand." Hank understood all too well. He'd seen the fresh perspective gathering dust on the owner's LinkedIn profile for weeks. Arthur, Artie, Vance, George Radford's nephew, fresh out of MIT with a master's in something suitably impressive sounding like digital transformation strategies. Brilliant kid, no doubt, but theory and the relentless, unforgiving grind of keeping a multi-million-dollar manufacturing operation online 24/7 were 2 very different beasts. Hank simply nodded, taking a slow sip of his iced water. "These things happen, Walter," he replied, a faint, unreadable smile playing on his lips. He saw the flicker of relief in Sterling's eyes. No scene, no messy confrontation. Perfect. That's exactly what Hank had intended. What Sterling didn't see, what no one in that room could see, was the intricate web of knowledge Hank held. The quiet understanding that he'd seen this particular chess move forming on the board months ago. The sting of betrayal, of course, was there. 11 years of building something from near ashes, of pouring his life into those servers and networks until they felt like extensions of himself. And for what? To be gracefully escorted out the door for the owner's kin. But beneath the sting, something else was stirring, a cold, clear sense of purpose. They thought they were just replacing a man. They didn't realize they were trying to discard the architect who held all the original blueprints, and more importantly, the keys. Before we dive deep into how Hank navigated this corporate chessboard, where loyalty seemed like a currency with a rapidly depreciating value, let me tell you a bit more about the world he'd built within Heartland Components, and the quiet strength that comes from knowing, truly knowing, your own worth, especially when others try to undervalue it. We'll explore the sting of that dismissal, yes, but also the surprising power of foresight, and how seeing the game clearly, perhaps more clearly than those making the moves, allows one to subtly, almost imperceptibly, begin to change the rules. How many of us, after all, have sat across a table, smiled, and nodded while our world tilted on its axis, just waiting, patiently, for the right moment to steady it again. On our own terms, Hank's moment was coming. It was just a matter of timing, and the meticulous execution of a plan they wouldn't see until it was far too late. To understand the depth of the cut Walter Sterling was attempting to make that day at the chairman's grill, you first have to appreciate the intricacy of what was being severed, or rather, what they thought they could cleanly sever. 11 years prior, Henry Bishop had walked into Heartland Components Incorporated not as a savior, but as a man looking for a place to land. His life had been upended. His marriage to Susan Miller, a 7-year chapter of shared dreams and quiet evenings, had ended with a polite but firm finality. "We want different things, Hank," she'd said, the divorce papers already resting on the familiar oak of their kitchen counter. No fights, no dramatic betrayals, just a quiet divergence of paths that left Hank adrift, sleeping on his brother's slightly lumpy couch in a quiet Crestwood City suburb. It was during this rudderless period that HCI found him, or perhaps they found each other. The company was in a quiet state of technological disarray. They knew machines, the tangible clang and whir of manufacturing, but computers were a necessary evil, tolerated rather than embraced. Their systems were creaking along on Windows XP. Passwords were quite literally scribbled on sticky notes affixed to monitors, and they'd just been singed by a ransomware attack that had brought their antiquated network to its knees. They needed someone, anyone, for a temporary fix. Hank took the job as a stopgap, something to keep his mind occupied, a place to pour the energy that had once gone into building a life with Susan. But where HCI saw a patch-up job, Hank saw potential. He saw an entire operation, millions in equipment and hundreds of jobs, teetering on the brink of digital disaster. One serious crash, one more sophisticated attack, and Heartland Components could grind to a halt. So he didn't just apply a Band-Aid. He walked into Walter Sterling's office, a man then less polished, more harried, and pitched a 5-year overhaul plan. Sterling, primarily focused on the production numbers and the bottom line, was initially skeptical, but there was a quiet, steady confidence in Hank, a lack of pretense, that was disarming. He wasn't selling snake oil, he was offering a lifeline. Sterling, perhaps seeing a way to offload a problem he didn't understand, gave him the budget and, crucially, the autonomy to work, and work Hank did. For the better part of 3 years, he barely saw daylight. He rebuilt every network from the ground up, designed security protocols that were robust yet user-friendly enough for a non-tech-savvy workforce. He patiently trained staff, transforming a 5-person, reactive help desk into a proactive 30-person operation that kept 3 sprawling production facilities in Milwaukee, Cedar Rapids, and here in Crestwood City, running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The machines didn't stop, and neither did Hank. Those servers, those intricate networks, they became his, not legally, perhaps, but in every way that mattered. He developed a proprietary suite of management and monitoring tools, a system he internally called CoreConnect, which integrated everything seamlessly. Then came the great Northeast blackout. Power grids failed across multiple states. Companies scrambled, but at HCI's facilities, the lights flickered, the backup generators kicked in, and Hank's meticulously designed systems ensured that not a single minute of production was lost. They were the only major facility in their entire region to stay online. That got the board's attention. Suddenly, Walter Sterling was bringing Hank to meetings, listening intently to his assessments. His budget tripled. He was finally able to hire the kind of talent he needed. People like Beverly Chen, sharp as a tack, who quickly became his indispensable right hand, anticipating needs before he even voiced them, and Frank Ramirez, a quiet, unassuming coder who could unravel the most tangled digital knots with an almost artistic elegance. They weren't just the IT department anymore. They were the silent engine that allowed HCI to confidently promise clients they'd never miss a deadline. The pinnacle of this quiet ascent, or so it felt at the time, was the company Christmas party in 2019. George Radford, the majority owner, a man rarely seen outside the boardroom, sought Hank out. He shook Hank's hand firmly, a rare smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Bishop," he'd said, his voice carrying the weight of authority, "you turned us into a modern operation. We couldn't have expanded into the new markets without your systems." For Hank, who had come to HCI feeling like spare parts, it was a moment of profound validation. He thought he'd finally found his place, a place where he truly mattered. It's a powerful feeling, isn't it, to build something lasting from almost nothing, to know that your hands, your mind, shape something vital. What happens then, when the very thing you nurtured, the thing that gave you purpose, is threatened by forces beyond your control, or worse, by the very people who once praised your creation? But even the most solid structures, built with meticulous care and reinforced by years of proven stability, can develop hairline fractures. Often, these tiny fissures begin in places you least expect, announced by unfamiliar voices asking deceptively simple questions, or by silences where there once was a steady flow of information. For Hank Bishop and his carefully architected world at Heartland Components, the first nearly invisible crack appeared late last September. It arrived in the form of a consultant, a Mr. Davies, who materialized unannounced one Tuesday morning with a polite but firm mandate to audit HCI's entire digital infrastructure. He asked surprisingly basic questions about systems Hank had designed and implemented years ago, systems whose intricacies were second nature to Hank and his team. When Hank, trying to understand the scope and origin of this sudden scrutiny, asked who had authorized the audit, Mr. Davies vaguely mentioned the executive team and deftly changed the subject. It was a small thing, a ripple in the otherwise smooth pond of his department, but it left Hank with a lingering sense of unease. Not long after, another small anomaly. Hank's access to the board meeting minutes, usually available on the secure executive shared drive, vanished. He clicked the familiar link, only to be met with an "access denied" message. When he inquired with Walter Sterling's assistant, the explanation was a breezy, "Oh, just some server cleanup. Hank, we're streamlining things." Streamlining. It was a corporate buzzword that often meant something was being quietly removed or restricted. Again, he tried to dismiss it. HCI was growing, processes changed, but the stone in his shoe, that small grain of discomfort, was beginning to make its presence felt. As autumn deepened into the early days of December, the chill wasn't just in the Crestwood city air. Walter Sterling, who had always maintained at least a weekly check-in with Hank, began canceling their IT briefings. There was always a reasonable excuse: a last-minute client meeting, an urgent conference call, the consistent flow of information, the casual back and forth that allowed Hank to anticipate upcoming needs and align his department's strategy with the company's broader goals, began to constrict. He was still doing his job. His systems were running flawlessly, but he was operating with less visibility, a subtle but significant shift. The new year brought the annual leadership retreat, a 2-day affair at a lodge upstate. It was mostly a blur of PowerPoint presentations and forced bonhomie. But one evening, standing by the stone fireplace, Hank overheard a fragment of conversation that would later click into place with unsettling clarity. George Radford, the owner, was speaking animatedly to another board member about his nephew, Arthur Vance, Artie, as he called him. "Brilliant with computers," Radford was saying, his voice laced with familial pride. "Just finishing his master's at MIT, top of his class. Silicon Valley companies are practically fighting over him." At the time, Hank registered it merely as an uncle's boast. He didn't connect the dots to his own world. Should have? He'd chastise himself months later, the words a bitter refrain in his mind. The most concrete, the most undeniable sign, however, was something only Hank would see, something buried deep within the digital entrails of HCI. It was about 3 months before that fateful lunch at the chairman's grill. During one of his routine late-night system integrity checks, he noticed them small, almost hesitant, unauthorized access attempts. They weren't aggressive, not like a brute force attack. These were more like someone carefully, methodically, testing doorknobs in a long, dark hallway. He traced the IP address. It originated from within HCI, from the executive floor. Someone was poking around in systems they shouldn't even know existed, looking at his detailed documentation, his carefully crafted security protocols, his contingency plans for every conceivable disaster. A cold knot formed in Hank's stomach. They weren't just idly curious. They were taking notes. They weren't just looking to replace me. He realized with a jolt that ran deeper than the impending job loss. They were mining me for everything I knew. First, that familiar unease, like a stone in your shoe you try to ignore, was no longer just a discomfort. It was a clear, undeniable signal that something was fundamentally wrong, a persistent whisper urging him to start paying much closer attention. Some goodbyes are delivered over lukewarm coffee in a paper cup. quick and impersonal. Others, like the one Hank Bishop was experiencing, were served on a silver platter at the chairman's grill, cold and final, despite the warm ambiance. Walter Sterling's pronouncements about fresh perspectives and the brilliant Arthur Artie Vance, the MIT-minted nephew, hung in the air between them, as heavy as the rich aroma of aged beef. Hank, maintaining his composure, just nodded, took another sip of water, and watched the relief play across Sterling's face. No drama, exactly as planned. The transition, Sterling explained, would be swift, 6 weeks. They'd make the official announcement after the quarterly all-hands meeting. Before the dessert plates even arrived, an NDA was presented, a crisp document outlining Hank's obligations of silence. He signed it with a steady hand, shook Sterling's offered one, and reiterated his understanding that business decisions had to be made. He walked out of the chairman's grill into the bright Crestwood city afternoon, the smile still in place, a carefully constructed mask. Back at his desk in the familiar hum of the HCI offices, the reality of their pre-planning hit him with the force of a quiet but decisive blow. He tried to log into his administrative console, access denied. His name had already been removed from the leadership team email distribution list. They hadn't just decided today. Over lunch, this had been orchestrated weeks, if not months, in advance. That night, sleep eluded him. It wasn't the anger, though there was plenty of that simmering beneath the surface. It wasn't even the fear of finding a new job. He knew his skills were marketable. No, what kept him staring at the ceiling was the memory of those surreptitious server logs from the executive floor, and the chilling clarity of what they now signified. The final, confirming piece of the puzzle arrived not through a digital trace, but through a human one. Beverly Chen, his sharp, loyal right hand, approached him a day or two later, her brow furrowed with concern. She'd been unexpectedly invited to a high-level strategic planning session, the kind Hank himself should have been leading. It was strange, Hank, she said, her voice low. When I mentioned your name, in the context of the existing infrastructure, Walter just changed the subject, smoothly, you know, but it felt off, like they were deliberately planning around you. Hank thought of his ex-wife Susan's old observation. Loyal to a fault, Hank, he had been. He'd brushed off Beverly's earlier, vaguer concerns. He wouldn't make that mistake again. A few evenings later, working late, a habit ingrained over 11 years, he was in the main server room, the cool, conditioned air of familiar comfort, the blinking lights of the racks like old friends. He turned to find Artie Vance standing in the doorway, clean-cut, expensive watch, an air of casual confidence that bordered on entitlement. He couldn't have been more than 30. Just doing some routine checks. Artie, Hank said, his voice even. You need something? Artie strolled in, hands in the pockets of his perfectly pressed chinos. Just getting the lay of the land, he replied, his gaze sweeping over the server configurations. Impressive setup, a bit old school, perhaps, but solid. Old school Hank had upgraded these very systems less than 8 months ago. Walter mentioned you'd be showing me around soon. Artie continued, your documentation is very thorough. Been reading through your protocols. I have some ideas for modernization. He said it as if he were doing Hank a favor. The words tasted like chalk in Hank's mouth. Looking forward to hearing them, he managed. After Artie left, his expensive cologne lingering in the sterile air, Hank sat down at his workstation and pulled up the access logs again. Arthur Vance's credentials had been created 3 full weeks before that lunch with Sterling. He'd been granted top-level administrator access from day one, and yes, he had already viewed Hank's entire documentation library, every blueprint, every failsafe, every piece of institutional knowledge Hank had painstakingly built. The next morning, the aroma of strong coffee from the Daily Grind Cafe usually offered a small comfort. Hank had called Frank Ramirez, his trusted coder, for a 6:30 a.m. meeting, no preamble. They're phasing me out, Frank, Hank said, stirring sugar he didn't need into his cup. Frank nodded slowly, his dark eyes troubled. He wasn't entirely surprised. I figured something was up, Frank admitted. They've been asking me some weird questions the last couple of weeks, having me explain parts of your systems. Things they shouldn't need me to explain if you were staying. He looked down at his own coffee. I'm sorry, man. I should have told you. Hank waved it away. Frank had a family, a mortgage in Crestwood Heights. Job security wasn't an abstract concept for him. Don't worry about it, Hank said. I get it. Then Frank looked up, his gaze direct. So, what's your plan? Hank? It was a simple question. But in that moment, Hank hadn't fully realized he had one, not a concrete one. Yet, sitting there, watching the early morning commuters hustle past the window, something settled inside him, a clarity he hadn't felt since the day he'd found Susan's divorce papers on the counter. Yes, he had a plan. In moments of betrayal, who do you turn to? Sometimes, a shared glance, a quiet word of understanding from someone who truly sees your worth can be the lifeline you didn't even know you were searching for. The first step in steadying a world that's been deliberately tilted. There's company property, the tangible assets listed on a balance sheet, and then there's the ingenuity you bring with you through the door, the intellectual spark they hired you for in the first place. Drawing that line in the sand, especially when the tide is trying to wash it away, can be the difference between walking away empty-handed and realizing you still hold the keys to a very important kingdom. At that small table in the Daily Grind Cafe, the aroma of brewing coffee thick in the air, Hank Bishop looked at Frank Ramirez, his loyal coder, and the pieces of his unspoken plan began to click into a more solid form. They think everything's in the documentation, Frank, Hank said quietly, his voice firm. But we both know it's not. Do we? Frank leaned forward, a knowing look in his eyes. He understood immediately. The proprietary tools Hank had developed over the years, the clever workarounds for HCI's sometimes antiquated hardware, the custom patches that weren't in any manual. And then there was CoreConnect, Hank's integrated system management suite, particularly its unique client interface, elegant, intuitive, and something no one else at HCI truly understood from the ground up. I'm not going to sabotage anything, Frank, Hank stated, meeting his friend's gaze. That's not who I am, but I'm not going to just give away what's mine either. What I built before I even walked through their doors. Frank nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. He got it. I need copies of everything I developed personally, Frank, Hank continued. And I need to know who on the team is still loyal, who hasn't been swayed by Artie's charm offensive. Frank agreed without hesitation. A silent pact formed over rapidly cooling coffee. The official announcement came during the all-hands meeting the following week. Walter Sterling stood at the podium, projecting an air of confident leadership, talking about exciting transitions and fresh perspectives. Arthur Vance stood beside him, smiling politely at the appropriate moments, looking every bit the young, eager executive. Hank Bishop has been instrumental in building our IT infrastructure, Sterling intoned, his gaze carefully avoiding Hank's corner of the room. And we're grateful for his contributions as he helps us transition to Artie's leadership over the next 6 weeks. A ripple of murmurs went through the room. Most of Hank's IT team looked genuinely shocked, their faces a mixture of disbelief and concern. Across the crowded conference hall, Beverly Chen's eyes found Hank's. He gave her the smallest, almost imperceptible nod. She understood. After the meeting, Hank requested a sit-down with Sterling and Helen Croft, HCI's no-nonsense HR representative. In Sterling's spacious office, with Helen observing silently, Hank laid his cards on the table. He pointed out that several of the systems Artie Vance would be taking over, most critically the CoreConnect Suite, were built by him outside of normal work hours, using his own development framework, before he had even joined Heartland Components. The employment contract is clear, Hank, Helen Croft stated, sliding a document across the polished mahogany table. Anything developed during your tenure is company property. Not everything, Hank countered calmly. The system sync interface, the core of CoreConnect, was developed well before I signed that contract with Riverton, with HCI. He corrected himself. The old name, a slip of the tongue from a story he'd once read, a story that now felt uncomfortably familiar. I licensed its use to the company, but retained full ownership. It's right there in the original agreement, if you'd care to look it up. Sterling shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair. That was 10 years ago, Hank, he said, a dismissive wave of his hand. The company has evolved, so have the systems. Indeed it has, Hank replied, leaning forward slightly. And every update, every integration of CoreConnect into HCI's evolving infrastructure was built upon my original code. I'm not trying to be difficult. Walter, Helen, I simply want proper compensation for my intellectual property. Sterling and Croft exchanged a quick, unreadable glance. We'll look into it. Hank, Sterling said finally, his tone noncommittal. In the meantime, please focus on the transition with Artie. Hank knew that look. They were stalling. The next morning, his access to the development servers was restricted. An automated email cited standard security protocol during transition periods. Later that day, Artie Vance called an IT team meeting, pointedly without inviting Hank. Hank showed up anyway, leaning against the doorframe. Artie, momentarily flustered but recovering quickly, was outlining changes to the network architecture, specifically for the main production floor systems. Interesting, Hank interjected. Which architecture specifically? Artie, regaining his confidence, explained they were going to streamline the protocols. Those protocols, Hank stated evenly, are what prevent catastrophic machine failures under peak load. They're custom designed for our specific equipment. Artie's smile tightened. Modern systems don't require such complex workarounds. Before Hank could reply, Beverly Chen spoke up, her voice clear and steady. They're not workarounds. Artie, they're necessary adaptations for our specific hardware. Hank designed them himself after the big system failure back in 2018. The room fell silent. Artie's confidence wavered for a split second. Well, he said, turning pointedly to the whiteboard, I appreciate the historical perspective, but we're moving forward with the streamlining. He'd effectively dismissed Hank. Later that afternoon, an email from HCI's legal department landed in Hank's inbox. The company was asserting full ownership of all systems, including CoreConnect, citing a vague clause about integrated technologies automatically becoming company property. They offered him a one-time technology acquisition bonus of $5,000, a pittance, an insult. But the real, gut-twisting betrayal came the following day. Frank Ramirez discreetly informed Hank that Artie had scheduled one-on-one meetings with each member of Hank's team. Not transition discussions, Frank clarified, but full job evaluations. Artie was assessing who to keep, who to discard, and he was actively fishing for criticism about Hank's leadership and systems, asking if they were really necessary or just overcomplicated. That night, adding another layer to the deceit, Hank found an email in his personal account from one of their key hardware suppliers. They were confused about a new licensing agreement HCI had sent over, one Hank knew nothing about. He pulled up the attached document. Walter Sterling had signed a deal transferring all of Hank's custom supplier integrations, the very interfaces that made their disparate systems talk to each other seamlessly, to a third-party vendor. A startup, Hank discovered with a quick search, founded by one of Artie Vance's former MIT classmates. They weren't just pushing him out. They were systematically dismantling everything he'd built and selling off the pieces. When he tried to access the backup servers to retrieve his original CoreConnect code, the code he knew was his credentials were an impenetrable wall revoked entirely. Game on. He needed leverage, and he needed it fast. Heartland Components hadn't just been careless. They'd been coldly calculating. The timeline was becoming painfully clear. Artie Vance had been brought in months ago, not as a trainee, but as a data miner, studying Hank's systems, preparing to replace him while simultaneously extracting every ounce of value he unknowingly possessed. When your back is against the wall, and everything you've built is being systematically dismantled not just by incompetence, but by deliberate, cynical design, what's your breaking point? And more importantly, what's your next move when you realize the game is far dirtier than you ever imagined? Sometimes, to find the unvarnished truth, you have to look beyond the polished presentations, the reassuring corporate speak, and into the shadows where the real deals are struck, where motivations are less about innovation and more about acquisition. Hank Bishop, now fully aware of the depth of the deception at Heartland Components, knew he couldn't fight this battle armed only with his own conviction. He needed facts, hard evidence that would cut through the legal jargon and corporate maneuvering. That evening, he reached out to Mark Jennings, a sharp, independent network security specialist he'd collaborated with on a complex cross-industry project years ago. Mark was based out of a small, unassuming office in a less glamorous part of Crestwood City, the kind of consultant who valued results over rhetoric. They met at the Nighthawk Diner, a 24-hour establishment off the interstate, the kind of place Walter Sterling or George Radford would never set foot in. Over greasy fries and surprisingly good coffee, Hank laid out the situation, the sudden replacement, Artie Vance, the data mining, the attempts to claim ownership of CoreConnect, the bizarre sale of his custom integrations. Mark listened intently, his expression growing more thoughtful with each detail. Legally, Hank, you're in a tough spot with the employment contract, as they usually are, Mark said, wiping his hands on a paper napkin. But something about this stinks. It doesn't add up. The company's doing well, right? Your systems are stable. Why push you out so aggressively now? It feels like there's a bigger piece missing. Mark leaned back in the cracked vinyl booth. Let me dig around a bit, just information gathering, nothing intrusive. See if anything shakes loose. 2 days later, Hank's phone buzzed close to 11 p.m. It was Mark. You need to see this. Hank. Mark's voice was urgent. He'd been scouring public records, SEC filings, industry news, and he'd found it. Heartland Components Incorporated was in late-stage talks to be acquired by Apex Manufacturing Solutions, a massive manufacturing conglomerate headquartered in Boston. The deal, Mark explained, his voice crackling slightly over the line, is contingent on HCI demonstrating modernized technical infrastructure and, get this, transitional leadership. The pieces slammed into place with sickening force. They're cleaning house, Hank, Mark continued, to make the sale look smoother, more attractive to Apex MS, and your systems, your CoreConnect Suite. They're not just a footnote, they're a major selling point. The valuation documents specifically mention HCI's proprietary manufacturing management interface. That's got to be CoreConnect. There was more. George Radford, HCI's majority owner, had cashed out a significant portion of his shares in the previous quarter. This acquisition wasn't primarily for Radford's benefit anymore. It was designed to enrich Walter Sterling and the executive team. They were looking at golden parachutes, lucrative executive positions at Apex MS. Hank was just a loose end, an inconvenient anachronism whose expertise was vital for the sale, but whose presence was apparently not. But the piece of information that truly broke through Hank's weary professionalism, the piece that felt like a personal, calculated betrayal, wasn't just about the acquisition. Mark had managed to unearth, through a source Hank didn't ask too many questions about, email correspondence, internal emails between Walter Sterling and George Radford. They had been discussing replacing Hank with Artie Vance for over 6 months. 6 months. While Hank had been pulling all-nighters to fix a major security breach that had threatened their entire enterprise network, a breach no one else on his team had the depth of knowledge to resolve. They were already interviewing his replacement. While he was safeguarding their assets, they were planning his obsolescence. The weight of it settled heavily on Hank. He drove aimlessly for a while that night, eventually finding himself in the deserted parking lot of the old industrial park on the outskirts of Crestwood City. It was here, years ago, armed with a notebook and a thermos of coffee, that he'd first sketched out the architecture for what would become CoreConnect, back when it was just an idea, a solution to a problem he saw long before HCI even knew they had it. He sat in his car until dawn, watching the sky turn a bruised purple, then a reluctant gray over the silent, abandoned warehouses. When he finally got home, exhausted but strangely clear-headed, he remembered something, an old external hard drive tucked away in a box in his closet, a relic from a previous computer, a previous life. He found it, plugged it in, and there it was. The original, unadulterated CoreConnect source code, pre-Heartland components. The documentation, meticulously dated, showing he'd begun development a full 8 months before he'd ever signed an employment contract with HCI. And then, the digital goldmine archived emails from his first year at HCI, Walter Sterling, in writing, specifically requesting that Hank integrate his impressive CoreConnect tool with HCI's existing systems. Sterling's explicit acknowledgement that it was Hank's proprietary technology, Sterling's promise that they would formalize the ownership and licensing details once things settled down. After the initial system overhaul, they had settled down. He had trusted him. Fool me once, Hank thought, a bitter taste in his mouth. But now he had the proof. The truth has a way of coming to light, doesn't it? And when it does, armed with indisputable facts, even the steepest, most treacherous hill starts to look climbable. The question then becomes not if you can fight, but how you choose to win. In chess, sometimes the most powerful move isn't an immediate, aggressive attack, but a carefully placed piece, a subtle shift in position that changes the entire dynamic of the board, often when the opponent is too focused on their own perceived advantage to notice. Armed with the irrefutable evidence from his old hard drive and Mark Jennings's discoveries, Hank Bishop felt a cold, steady resolve solidify within him. The emotional sting of betrayal was still there, but it was now overlaid with the sharp clarity of a strategist preparing for a decisive engagement. The very next day, as if on cue, Hank was summoned to Walter Sterling's office. Helen Croft from HR was present, as was Artie Vance, looking particularly self-assured. "Hank," Sterling began, without preamble, his tone brisk. "We're accelerating the transition." Hank raised an eyebrow. "Your last day will be next Friday. 2 weeks instead of the previously agreed upon 6. Any particular reason?" Hank asked, his voice betraying no emotion. Helen Croft fielded that one, her smile tight and insincere. "Artie has demonstrated exceptional capability in grasping the essentials of our systems. And frankly, Derek, Hank," she corrected herself, a small, telling slip. "Your recent attitude hasn't been entirely conducive to a smooth handover." Hank nodded slowly. "I see. We'll need you to complete all documentation and training for Artie by Wednesday of next week," Artie added, a hint of managerial authority creeping into his voice. "Of course," Hank replied, his voice steady. He paused, then looked directly at Sterling. "And the ownership of CoreConnect. Have you had time to review the original agreements I mentioned?" Sterling's expression hardened. "Our legal team has reviewed the situation. Hank, they've determined that all integrated systems, as per your contract, fall under company ownership. The separation package we're offering is generous. I suggest you take it." Hank stood up. "I'll have my lawyer review everything." "Walter?" Sterling's eyes narrowed. "Don't make this difficult. Hank, it won't change the outcome." As Hank walked out of the office, the threat hanging in the air, he discreetly texted Frank Ramirez, "Plan B, tonight." 7 hours later, in the dimly lit parking lot of a suburban grocery store, Frank handed Hank a small, unlabeled flash drive. "Everything you asked for?" Frank said quietly. "Original code bases for everything you touched, deployment logs, system authentication keys from before Artie started changing things." Hank took the drive, the weight of it feeling far greater than its physical size. "Why are you doing this?" "Frank, you're taking a risk." Frank looked him dead in the eye. "Because they think we're all replaceable. Hank, they forget who actually builds things around here, who keeps the lights on. You always had our backs. It's time someone had yours." The following weekend was a blur of meticulous activity for Hank. He wasn't just angry, he was focused. He documented everything: the original CoreConnect source code from his old hard drive, the damning emails with Walter Sterling, the original licensing agreement drafts, the precise dates proving he'd developed the core technology long before setting foot in Heartland Components. He was building an unshakable case. Monday morning, he arrived early at HCI. Beverly Chen was already at her desk, looking tired and stressed. "You heard about the accelerated timeline?" she asked, her voice hushed. Hank nodded. "How's the team taking it?" Beverly sighed. "Not well. Artie called emergency planning sessions all weekend. Tried to get them to reverse engineer your primary production floor monitoring system. From what I hear," she lowered her voice further, It didn't go well at all. Hank kept his expression neutral. Oh, Beverly elaborated. 3 critical alerts from the Milwaukee production line got missed on Saturday. No one was seriously hurt, thankfully, but they had to shut down line 3 for nearly 4 hours. Cost the company about $40,000 in lost production, according to the shift supervisor. Sorry to hear that, Hank said, and he meant it, for the workers, for the potential damage. Beverly hesitated, then looked at him directly. Derek, Hank, I think I'm next on their list. Artie's been asking a lot of pointed questions about whether my role is truly necessary, if my responsibilities couldn't be absorbed by someone. Cheaper? Hank had suspected as much. Beverly knew too much about how things really worked. Do you trust me, Beverly? Hank asked quietly. She didn't hesitate. Completely, he slid a sealed, plain manila envelope across the desk to her. If anything happens this week, anything unusual, anything that feels off after I'm gone, open this. It explains everything. That afternoon, Hank met with 3 separate patent attorneys, paying rush fees to file provisional patents on several key critical components of his CoreConnect Suite. Not the entire system, but the specific innovative algorithms that made it interface so effectively with complex manufacturing equipment. On Tuesday, Hank was the model departing employee. He completed all the transition documentation Artie Vance requested, attended his planning meetings, answered every question politely and thoroughly. Meanwhile, his friend Mark Jennings was helping him set up a secure, independent server offsite. By midnight on Tuesday, Hank had transferred all his original CoreConnect code to that server. He then created a fully functional, standalone version of CoreConnect, one that could run entirely independently of HCI's internal infrastructure. Wednesday morning brought an unexpected email to Hank's personal account. It was from the Vice President of Operations at Apex Manufacturing Solutions, the Boston conglomerate poised to acquire HCI. They'd heard he was leaving Heartland Components and were very interested in discussing his expertise regarding integrated manufacturing systems. Someone at Apex MS was clearly hedging their bets, perhaps already sensing potential turbulence in the HCI acquisition. Hank forwarded the email to his lawyer, then made a call to the Apex VP. They agreed to meet the week after his official departure from HCI. That night, Wednesday, with his departure just 2 days away, Hank executed the key part of his plan. Using a set of still valid, low-level access credentials Frank had managed to preserve on the flash drive, credentials Artie's team hadn't yet discovered or changed, Hank logged into the CoreConnect system one last time. He didn't damage anything. He didn't delete files or plant viruses. He simply made 2 very precise, very subtle updates to 3 critical operational components of the CoreConnect Suite running across all of HCI's facilities. First, he added a digital signature verification protocol. This would check if the core operating code had been modified by any unauthorized parties after his departure. If it detected tampering, it would flag it. Second, and most importantly, he updated the master license key for CoreConnect. He set it to expire in exactly 8 days, precisely 24 hours after his official, documented departure from Heartland Components. He was creating a clean, legal transition path. The system would continue functioning perfectly if a proper, new licensing agreement was put in place. Nothing destructive, nothing overtly malicious. He was simply protecting what was unequivocally his. Thursday morning, Artie Vance pulled Hank into his new, larger office. Some of the team members have mentioned you've been acting a bit strangely, Hank, Artie said, attempting a tone of managerial concern. Anything I should know about? Hank met his gaze calmly. Just focused on wrapping everything up, Artie, ensuring a smooth transition, as requested. Artie studied him for a moment, a flicker of suspicion in his eyes. Well, just so you know, we'll be changing all system passwords and access credentials first thing tomorrow morning, immediately after your departure. Standard procedure. Makes sense, Hank replied, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. Though, it won't affect the core functionality of CoreConnect. The system is designed to work regardless of most administrative changes. That's the beauty of it. Really? He could see Artie trying to decide if that was a threat or just an informative statement. Artie, predictably, chose to interpret it as the latter. "Good. I think we're good here then," he said, dismissing Hank. "Legal will meet with you tomorrow for the final paperwork." As Hank walked out, he passed Walter Sterling in the hallway. Sterling barely nodded. 11 years. Reduced to that. By midnight that Thursday, everything was in place. Hank sent one final, encrypted email to his private, off-site server. The subject line was simple. Verification sequence Alpha 7 complete. The countdown had begun. Friday morning. Hank turned in his badge and laptop. He signed the exit paperwork, politely declining the celebration lunch Artie Vance had ostentatiously organized. He could see the visible relief on Walter Sterling's face as he walked towards the exit. Freedom? Of a sort. As he reached his car in the parking lot, his phone rang. It was Frank Ramirez. "It's done! Hank!" Frank said, his voice low. "Artie just finished changing all the admin passwords across the board. They're launching a full system review this afternoon." "Thanks for letting me know, Frank," Hank said, keeping his voice neutral. "What happens now?" Frank asked, a note of anxiety in his tone. Hank started his car. "Now, Frank," he said, a sense of profound calm settling over him. "Now we wait." He spent the weekend at home, ignoring a flurry of calls from unknown numbers, and slept more soundly than he had in months. Monday morning dawned bright and clear. At precisely 9:17 a.m., exactly when the production floors at all 3 Heartland Components facilities shifted into peak operational load, every single instance of the CoreConnect Suite, every monitor, every control panel displayed the same, elegantly simple message: "License expired. Please contact the developer to renew." By 9:20 a.m., the first automated production line in Milwaukee ground to a halt. By 9:45 a.m., all 3 HCI facilities were effectively offline. The meticulously built, carefully maintained heart of Heartland Components Incorporated had quietly, decisively stopped beating. There's a profound quietness in knowing you've set events in motion that cannot be undone by those who underestimated you, by those who tried to erase your value. What does it feel like, Hank wondered with a grim sort of satisfaction, to finally hold the lever of control, especially when it's been so rudely snatched away? The loudest silences are often followed by the most panicked phone calls. And in those moments, true leverage isn't about shouting, or threats, or recriminations. It's about knowing precisely what you're worth, and more importantly, what they can no longer live without. At 10:30 a.m. that Monday morning, Henry Bishop's personal cell phone, which had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally rang. The caller ID displayed Walter Sterling's name. Hank let it ring 3 times before answering, his voice calm, almost serene. "Hello, Walter." "Bishop, what the hell did you do?" Sterling's voice was tight, strained, a stark contrast to the smooth, confident CEO Hank had faced across the lunch table just weeks before. He was trying to sound authoritative, but the panic was clearly audible, a thin, reedy note under the bluster. "I didn't do anything, Walter," Hank replied calmly, picturing the chaos undoubtedly unfolding at HCI headquarters. "The software license for CoreConnect Suite expired. As the developer and sole owner of the CoreConnect technology, I'm happy to discuss renewal terms with Heartland Components at your earliest convenience." "This is sabotage. Bishop, I'll have your head for this," Sterling hissed into the phone. "Actually, Walter, it's standard license management," Hank corrected him, his tone still even, almost professorial. "I believe if you check Clause 7 of the original integration agreement we signed 11 years ago, the one I specifically asked you and Helen Croft to review, you'll find it clearly states that Heartland Components was licensing the use of the CoreConnect technology, not purchasing it outright." A heavy silence descended on the other end of the line, broken only by the faint sound of what might have been Sterling's ragged breathing. Hank could almost visualize him, red-faced, gesturing furiously to a hapless assistant to find that ancient document. "I've already taken the liberty of sending a property updated licensing agreement to your legal department this morning. Walter," Hank continued smoothly, The terms are quite simple. Firstly, full and unequivocal recognition of my ownership of the CoreConnect Suite and all its underlying intellectual property. Secondly, fair and appropriate compensation for its continued use by Heartland Components. And thirdly, a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement regarding the circumstances of my rather abrupt departure. "That's extortion," Sterling finally sputtered. "No, Walter," Hank replied, a hint of steel now in his voice. "That's business. These things happen. Remember, you have until 300 p.m. today for your legal team to review and sign. Otherwise, I'll assume HCI is no longer interested in utilizing CoreConnect, and I'll begin exploring other opportunities for its application." He didn't need to mention Apex Manufacturing Solutions, or their already scheduled meeting. By 2:45 p.m., Hank's lawyer called. HCI's legal team had reviewed Hank's meticulously prepared documentation, the original code, the dated development notes, the crucial emails from Sterling himself. They had no leg to stand on. By 5:00 p.m., the new licensing agreement, with all of Hank's terms met, was signed, scanned, and delivered. The production lines at Heartland Components would be humming again by morning, but under a new paradigm, one where the architect was finally acknowledged and compensated for his creation. 3 days later, Hank sat across a polished boardroom table in a downtown Crestwood City skyscraper, this time with the Vice President of Operations for Apex Manufacturing Solutions. The VP, a woman named Margaret Atwood, was direct and professional. "We're still proceeding with the acquisition of Heartland Components, Mr. Bishop," she stated. "Frankly, your CoreConnect Suite is one of their most valuable assets. We want you to lead the technical integration of HCI's systems into the broader Apex MS framework, as an independent consultant, of course, not an employee." The proposed salary was more than double what he'd earned at HCI, with full autonomy over his working hours and location. "What about Arthur Vance?" Hank asked, curious. Ms. Atwood's expression soured almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Vance," she said, a slight chill in her tone, "will be transitioning to explore other opportunities once the acquisition is finalized. His particular skill set, it seems, is not quite aligned with Apex's operational needs." Hank signed the consulting contract that afternoon. 2 weeks later, Frank Ramirez called Hank with an update. Artie Vance had been quietly, unceremoniously removed from his position at HCI. The official story was that he'd pursued other opportunities. The actual reason, Frank had heard through the grapevine, was that 3 of HCI's major clients had threatened to pull their multi-million-dollar contracts after repeated, significant system failures and production delays during Artie's brief, chaotic tenure at the helm of IT. Walter Sterling remained CEO through the initial acquisition by Apex MS, but his role quickly became largely ceremonial. He kept a fancy title and a corner office, but he was conspicuously distant from any real decision-making power, no real team to lead, just a figurehead, marking time. Hank didn't feel the sharp, vindictive triumph he might have once imagined. Instead, there was a quiet certainty, a deep, resonant satisfaction that he'd done what was necessary, not just for himself, but for the integrity of his work. The following month, he used his first substantial consulting check from Apex MS to put a down payment on a small, rustic cabin nestled by a quiet lake a couple of hours north of Crestwood City. Nothing fancy, just a peaceful place with a sturdy deck overlooking the water. Somewhere he could watch the sun set and rise again. A place to think, to plan his next venture. Beverly Chen joined his new consulting team 3 months later, her relief palpable. Frank Ramirez followed soon after. Eventually, nearly half of his old, dedicated department from HCI found their way to his growing business, not as employees, but as valued partners, sharing in the success they helped create. About a year after everything had transpired, Hank was having dinner at a new restaurant downtown when he saw Walter Sterling walk in. Sterling looked older, the confident swagger replaced by a weary stoop. He started to turn away, then seemed to think better of it and approached Hank's table. "Bishop," he said, his voice subdued, You won. Hank looked at him, really looked at the man who had tried to discard him like an obsolete piece of hardware, the strain around his eyes, the slightly rumpled suit. It wasn't about winning, Walter, Hank replied, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. They tried to take what I built, erase my value. This was about proving what that value truly was, to them, to Apex, and most importantly, to myself. Knowing your worth, Walter, that's the real win? Sterling just nodded once, then turned and walked away. Hank sat there for a long time, watching the city lights begin to twinkle on across the river, reflecting on the nature of systems, the ones we build with wires and code, the ones we navigate in corporate hallways, and the ones we break when trust is fractured, and ultimately, the ones that truly outlast us all. He had built something. They had tried to break him, and in the end, he had rebuilt himself, stronger, and on his own terms. Henry Bishop didn't set out to be a revolutionary or a corporate raider. He was a builder, an architect of systems, a man who found solace and purpose in making complex things work seamlessly. But when the foundations of fairness, respect, and professional integrity were attacked, he used his knowledge, his foresight, and his quiet resolve not just to defend his work, but to redefine his own worth, on his own terms. It's a powerful reminder, isn't it, that true value isn't always recognized by a title on a business card or the number on a paycheck, but by the undeniable impact of your contributions and the quiet integrity with which you stand by them and by yourself. What parts of Henry's journey, his quiet battle for recognition and fairness, resonated with you the most? Have you ever had to stand up for your own CoreConnect Suite in your life? That unique value that only you can bring? I'd genuinely love to hear your thoughts and perhaps your own stories in the comments below. And if narratives like these, about everyday resilience, quiet triumphs, and the enduring strength of the human spirit, speak to your heart, perhaps consider subscribing for more. It truly helps us bring these kinds of important stories to light for others who might need to hear them. Because in the end, the systems we build within ourselves, our principles, our unwavering belief in our own worth, our quiet resolve in the face of adversity, those are the ones that truly endure, long after the applause has faded and the boardroom lights have dimmed.